My name is Saman. For over 2 decades, I lived the life of a devoted monk, my days marked by meditation, teaching, and the pursuit of enlightenment. Born in a small village, I found my way to the monastery at a young age, drawn by the peace and simplicity of the Buddhist path. The teachings of the Buddha, compassion, mindfulness, and detachment became the foundation of my life. Every morning before the sun rose, I would sit in meditation, focusing on the breath, silencing the mind, and seeking the clarity that the Eightfold Path promises. The monastery was my world, a place of harmony, where the sounds of chanting monks blended with the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was a life stripped of distractions, centered on the pursuit of nirvana, the ultimate liberation from suffering. I taught others what I had learned, guiding lay people and younger monks through the principles of impermanence and non-attachment. My role was to help them navigate the suffering inherent in life, to see beyond the illusions of desire and ego. Many came to me with their struggles, grief, fear, longing, and I tried to show them how to let go and find peace. Christianity, or any other religion for that matter, was not something I ever gave much thought to. To me, all paths were simply expressions of people seeking answers to the same questions about existence. I saw Christianity as a religion tied to desire for salvation and attachment to a deity, concepts that seemed contrary to the detachment I had cultivated. I had no animosity toward it, but I saw no need for it either. The teachings of the Buddha, I believed, were sufficient. My life was predictable, peaceful, and seemingly complete. I thought I understood the nature of existence and my place within it. But all of that changed one fateful evening. It started as an ordinary day. I spent the morning leading a meditation session for visitors and then joined my fellow monks for the midday meal. The afternoon passed in quiet study, reading ancient texts and reflecting on their meanings. As the sun began to set, I took a walk through the monastery gardens, a practice I cherished for its stillness and solitude. But something felt off. I noticed a faint pressure in my chest, a discomfort I couldn't quite place. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was nothing more than fatigue. As the evening progressed, the sensation grew stronger, radiating through my chest and into my arms. I tried to sit and meditate, hoping to focus my mind and calm my body, but the pain became unbearable. I was rushed to the nearest hospital, the journey a blur of flashing lights and muffled voices. My body, once a vessel of calm and control, now felt like it was betraying me. The doctors spoke in hurried tones, their faces serious, but I could barely process their words. All I knew was that the pain was consuming me, and I was powerless to stop it. Lying on the hospital bed, surrounded by the hum of machines and the sterile smell of antiseptic, I felt my body growing weaker. My breath, once steady and intentional, became shallow and erratic. The sounds around me began to fade, replaced by a strange stillness. My vision blurred, and the faces of the doctors became indistinct shadows. I felt myself slipping away, as if the threads tethering me to the world were slowly unraveling. And then, as my physical world faded, I sensed something unfamiliar. It was overwhelming, unlike anything I had ever encountered in my years of meditation or study. It wasn't emptiness, or the void I had imagined as the end of life. It was something else, something alive, a presence. As my world faded into darkness, I suddenly became aware that I was no longer confined to my body. At first, it was disorienting, as if I had slipped out of one form and into another, weightless and untethered. I could see the hospital room clearly, the machines beeping in rhythm with the frantic efforts of the medical staff. They worked with precision, their faces tense with concentration, trying to save what I now realized was my body. It was an odd sensation, observing myself from above. I saw my own face, pale and motionless, my chest rising faintly as the doctors struggled to stabilize me. I knew it was me, yet I felt no attachment to it. I wasn't afraid or panicked, only curious. How could I see this? How could I be here and there at the same time? Years of meditation had taught me to detach from the physical, to view my thoughts and feelings as impermanent. But this was something entirely different. This was detachment on a scale I had never imagined. I watched as one of the doctors called out instructions, her voice sharp and urgent. A nurse adjusted a monitor, her hands moving swiftly, while another injected something into my arm. It was surreal, seeing them work so hard to save a life that I no longer seemed to be part of. I noticed every detail, the beads of sweat on the doctor's forehead, the trembling hands of a young nurse. I even felt a faint echo of their emotions, an undercurrent of determination mixed with fear. In the corner of the room, I saw my abbot, his hands clasped in prayer. He had come to the hospital as soon as he heard, and now he stood quietly, his eyes closed, lips moving in silent recitation. His presence was comforting, a reminder of the life I had lived, but I felt strangely disconnected from it. My thoughts weren't of the monastery or my teachings. Instead, I was overwhelmed by the sheer mystery of what was happening. As I floated above the scene, a new sensation began to pull at me. It wasn't physical, but it was undeniable, a gentle yet insistent force drawing me away from the room. I tried to resist, unsure of where it was taking me, but the pull grew stronger. It was as if the very essence of my being was being drawn towards something beyond my understanding. And then I saw it, a light. It wasn't the harsh, sterile light of the hospital or the dim glow of a candle in meditation. This light was different, radiant, alive, and utterly pure. It emanated warmth, not just in a physical sense, but in a way that reached deep into the core of my being. It didn't blind or overwhelm me. Instead, it invited me, called me, as though it had been waiting for me all along. The light seemed to pulse gently, almost like it was breathing. Its presence was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I had spent years meditating, seeking enlightenment, striving to reach a state of ultimate clarity and peace. Yet this light carried something far beyond what I had ever known. It wasn't emptiness or detachment, it was fullness, a completeness that resonated with every part of me. At first, I hesitated. What was this light? Where did it come from? My teachings had always spoken of impermanence, of letting go of attachments and desires. Yet this light seemed to offer something else entirely, something permanent, something unchanging. It was both alluring and unsettling, challenging everything I thought I knew. As I lingered, torn between curiosity and reluctance, the pull of the light grew stronger. It wasn't forceful, but it was irresistible. It was as though the light was speaking to me, not in words, but in a language I could feel. An invitation that bypassed logic and reached straight into the heart of who I was. Despite my uncertainty, I felt myself moving toward it, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. The closer I came, the more the light seemed to envelop me. Its warmth was unlike anything I had ever felt. Not just physical warmth, but a sense of being completely known and completely loved. It was as if the light was seeing every part of me, my thoughts, my actions, my doubts, and yet it embraced me fully. I had spent years striving to let go of ego, to detach from the self, but this light wasn't asking me to let go. It was offering me something in return, something deeper, something I couldn't yet understand. As I approached, I began to feel a presence within the light, something alive and immensely powerful. It wasn't a void, as I had expected from years of seeking nirvana. This presence was personal, intentional, and filled with a love so profound that it overwhelmed me. I felt small in its presence, yet not insignificant. Instead, I felt cared for, seen, and deeply valued. The tension within me, between my teachings and what I was experiencing, grew sharper. I wanted to hold on to what I knew, to the framework that had guided my life, but the light seemed to dissolve those barriers effortlessly. It wasn't rejecting my past, it was fulfilling something I hadn't realized was missing. I tried to look deeper into the light, to understand it, but the closer I came, the more it seemed to encompass everything. I felt a sense of anticipation, as though I were on the verge of discovering something profound, something that would change me forever. And then, as I crossed fully into the light, I felt its embrace completely envelop me. The warmth, the peace, the presence, it was all-consuming, yet it didn't erase me. Instead, it made me feel more alive than I had ever been. Whatever lay ahead, I knew it was something entirely new, something I had never expected. As I stood within the light, bathed in its warmth and beauty, I sensed the presence of something, or rather, someone, unlike anything I had ever encountered. At first, I couldn't see him clearly, but the feeling of his presence was undeniable. It was as though he were not just near me, but within me, filling every part of my being with a profound sense of peace and love. Then, as if stepping out from the very light itself, a figure began to form. His face emerged from the glow, clear and radiant, and I knew immediately who he was. It was Jesus, the man I had dismissed my entire life as a central figure in a misguided faith. The man who, for so many, was the Messiah. But now, as I looked at him, I saw something entirely different. He wasn't just a figure from a book or a concept I had rejected. He was real. He was here, and he was looking at me with eyes filled with such love and authority that it struck me to my core. There was no arrogance in his presence, only compassion, deep and unwavering. His gaze was not judgmental, but understanding, as though he could see every part of me, the good, the bad, the doubts, the fears, and yet there was no condemnation, only acceptance. I had always sought to detach from my ego, but now, standing before him, I felt something greater than ego, a divine connection. "You are here," Jesus said, his voice steady and calm, yet carrying an undeniable weight. "You've sought truth your whole life, Saman. Now you are here to see it." His words pierced me in ways I could not explain. I wanted to respond, to challenge him, but I found that the words caught in my throat. What could I say to someone who was standing before me in such undeniable truth? All the meditation, all the disciplines, all the teachings I had followed, all of it seemed so small, so distant, in the face of this reality. "Why have you come?" I asked, my voice trembling, unsure whether it was even a question. Was I meant to be here? What was happening? Jesus stepped closer, his presence enveloping me, and he spoke gently, yet with an authority that stirred something deep within me. "You are here because you have been called, because the truth you seek is not found in isolation, in detachment from the world. It is found in me." These words struck me like a lightning bolt. I had spent my life searching for peace, enlightenment, and liberation from suffering. I had believed that the path of meditation, of mindfulness, would lead me to the ultimate truth, nirvana, a state beyond suffering, beyond the cycle of birth and death. But now, here in this moment, I was being told that the path I had followed was incomplete, that the peace I sought, the liberation I longed for, could only be found in Jesus. I struggled to reconcile this with everything I had believed. The idea that suffering could be overcome by detachment was central to my life. Yet Jesus was showing me something different. He wasn't speaking of escape from suffering, but of entering into it, experiencing it fully, and through that, finding healing. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why would suffering lead to salvation? I've always believed that salvation lies in the cessation of suffering, in detachment." Jesus looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and compassion. "Saman, you misunderstand the nature of suffering. It is not the avoidance of pain that brings peace, but the willingness to face it with love. The path I walked was filled with suffering, not as a way of avoiding it, but as a way to transform it, to show that there is no need to escape the world's pain, but to embrace it, knowing that through that love, suffering is redeemed." His words resonated deeply with me. For the first time, I understood that suffering, instead of being something to avoid, could be something that led to deeper understanding, deeper connection, and ultimately to a kind of peace far greater than any I had ever known. As I tried to process his words, Jesus began to show me visions. They were vivid and clear, like scenes from a life that was both distant and immediate. I saw Jesus' life unfold before me, the miracles, the teachings, the love he gave freely to those around him. I saw the cross, and I felt the weight of it, the agony he endured, the betrayal, the pain. But I also saw the resurrection, the victory over death, the promise of life beyond the grave. It was the fulfillment of all the promises, the truth that I had never seen before. The visions shifted, and I saw scenes that contrasted sharply with my understanding of karma and enlightenment. I saw Jesus forgiving those who had wronged him, loving those who hated him. I saw the ultimate sacrifice, his death on the cross, and for the first time, I understood it, not as a symbol of suffering alone, but as a profound act of love and redemption. The notion of self-sacrifice, The willingness to endure suffering for the sake of others was something I had never fully grasped in my own practice. I had always believed that my suffering and the suffering of others was a result of karma, a natural consequence of past actions. But now I saw something more. Jesus didn't just endure suffering because it was his karmic fate. He chose to bear it for the redemption of all. He offered love, grace, and forgiveness in the midst of his agony. And through that, he showed me that salvation isn't about escaping suffering, but transforming it. "Do you see now?" Jesus asked gently, his voice filled with tenderness. I nodded slowly, my mind reeling with the enormity of what I had just seen. Everything I had believed, every principle I had lived by, was being turned upside down. I had spent so many years seeking peace through detachment. Yet here, in this moment, I understood that peace was not found by turning away from suffering, but by embracing it with love and understanding. "You have come to understand that which your heart has been seeking," Jesus said softly. "But there is more. There is a purpose in this understanding, a purpose that goes beyond yourself." I was still processing his words when he continued. "The truth you now know is not just for you, it is for others. You have seen the way, Salmon. Now you must share it." I felt a deep sense of responsibility, but I was also afraid. How could I share this truth? How could I stand before my community, my fellow monks, and speak of Jesus, of Christianity? I had spent my life teaching the teachings of the Buddha. How could I now speak of a different path? But Jesus' gaze was steady, and his presence filled me with peace. "You are not alone," he said, as if sensing my fear. "I will be with you." And as he spoke, I felt a sense of purpose stir within me. The path ahead would be challenging, but it was the only path that mattered. The truth I had discovered was not something to hide, but something to share. "Are you ready, Saman?" Jesus asked, his voice calm but firm. I wasn't sure what to say, but deep within me, I knew my journey had just begun. As I stood there, overwhelmed by the weight of his message, I realized that everything I thought I knew about salvation, suffering, and love was about to change forever. What I had thought was the end was only the beginning. As I stood in the light, still reeling from the presence of Jesus and the profound truths he had revealed, the scene began to shift. The warmth and radiance of the light gave way to something even more extraordinary. It was as though the fabric of reality itself was peeling back, revealing realms beyond anything I had ever imagined. The first was a place of indescribable peace and beauty, a realm so pure, so filled with love, that I struggled to comprehend it. The colors were vibrant, yet they seemed to be alive, resonating with a harmony that reached into my very soul. The air was filled with a melody, not of instruments, but of joy, unity, and a deep connection to something infinitely greater than myself. "This," Jesus said, his voice gentle yet filled with authority, "is heaven. Heaven." The word felt foreign to me, yet as I gazed upon it, I understood. This was not merely a place, but a state of being, one of perfect unity with God. The love that radiated here was unlike anything I had experienced, even in my most profound meditations. It wasn't just an absence of suffering. It was a fullness, a completeness that surpassed all understanding. In this place, there was no striving, no struggle to achieve enlightenment. There was only the presence of God, and it was enough. I saw beings there, people, radiant and joyful, their faces filled with peace. They weren't detached from their emotions or experiences. Instead, they seemed to embrace them fully, transformed by the love that surrounded them. This is the destiny of those who choose to walk with me, Jesus said, his gaze unwavering. It is not earned through deeds alone, but through faith, through love, and through grace. The concept of grace was new to me. In Buddhism, we spoke of karma, the idea that one's actions determined their future experiences. But grace, it was something freely given, not earned. It was a gift, an invitation to accept a love that surpassed all effort or merit. Before I could fully process this, the scene shifted again. The light dimmed, and I found myself standing in a place that felt utterly devoid of the peace I had just experienced. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the colors, if they could even be called that, were muted and lifeless. A chill ran through me as I heard distant cries, low at first, but growing louder, filled with anguish and regret. "This," Jesus said, his voice now solemn, "is hell. Hell." The word sent a shiver through me. It wasn't the fiery pit I had imagined from stories I had dismissed as myths. It was far more profound. It was a place of separation from the light, from love, from God. The beings here were not being punished by an external force. They were consumed by their own choices, their rejection of truth and grace. I saw figures moving through the shadows, their faces etched with sorrow and regret. They reached out, not for others, but for themselves, their isolation so complete that it was as though they were trapped within their own suffering. It was a stark contrast to the unity I had witnessed in heaven. "This is the consequence of rejecting love," Jesus said. "It is not my desire for any to be here, but love requires choice, and with choice comes responsibility." The weight of his words settled on me. For so long, I had believed that suffering was simply a natural part of existence, a cycle to be broken through detachment and enlightenment. But here, I saw suffering in its truest form, a separation from the very source of life and love. It wasn't merely an absence of good, it was the presence of despair, born from turning away from the truth. Jesus turned to me, his expression filled with both compassion and urgency. "Saman, you have seen the consequences of choice. You have seen the reality of heaven and hell. But there is more you must understand." The scene shifted once more, and I was back in the light, standing before him. He began to speak of the divine truth that underpinned all existence, a truth I had sought but never fully grasped. "The path you have walked," he said, "was not in vain. Your pursuit of peace, your dedication to compassion, these were seeds planted in your heart. But the truth you sought cannot be found in detachment. It is found in relationship, in love, in me." He explained how his life and sacrifice fulfilled the deepest longings of the human heart. He spoke of how the law and teachings I had followed, though noble, were incomplete without the grace and redemption he offered. It wasn't about abandoning my past, but about seeing it in the fullness of his truth. "You were created for relationship," he continued, "not just with yourself, or with the world, but with the one who made you. The peace you sought is not an escape from suffering, but a transformation of it through love. As he spoke, I felt as though layers of misunderstanding were being stripped away. For years, I had viewed salvation as a solitary journey, one that required discipline and detachment. But now I saw that true salvation was a gift, a relationship that could only be accepted, not achieved. Jesus then looked at me, his eyes filled with a love so intense it brought tears to mine. You have seen the truth, Salmon, but it is not yours to keep. You must share what you have seen, what you now know. There are many who walk the path you once did, seeking answers in the dark. You must be a light to them. His words filled me with both awe and fear. How could I, a simple monk, carry such a message? How could I share this truth with those who might reject it as I once had? But even as these doubts swirled within me, I felt a deep sense of purpose growing stronger. It is time for you to return, Jesus said, his voice soft but firm. Your journey in this life is not yet complete. You have been shown these things for a reason. Go and walk the path I have set before you. As the light began to fade, I felt his presence remain with me, a reassurance that I would not walk this path alone. My heart was heavy with the weight of what I had seen, but it was also filled with clarity and a sense of mission. Everything I thought I knew about the world, about life, and about salvation had been turned upside down. And now I was being sent back to share this truth, a truth that would change everything. The moment I returned to my body was like being pulled through a tunnel, the warmth of the light fading as I was thrust back into the harsh, sterile environment of the hospital room. My eyes fluttered open, and I was immediately overwhelmed by the chaos around me. The sounds of machines beeping, the hurried voices of doctors and nurses, and the sight of bright lights above me flooded my senses all at once. My chest ached and my breathing felt labored, but it wasn't the physical pain that disoriented me. It was the jarring transition from the presence of divine peace back into the confines of my fragile human body. His vitals are stabilizing, one of the doctors shouted, relief evident in her voice. A nurse leaned over me, her eyes wide with disbelief. You're back, she said softly, as if speaking the words aloud would help her process what she was seeing. I could feel the weight of their astonishment, but I couldn't focus on them. My mind was reeling, still processing the overwhelming reality of what I had just experienced. As the medical team worked around me, adjusting machines and checking my condition, I caught a glimpse of my abbot standing in the corner of the room. His hands were clasped in prayer, his face pale and etched with concern. When our eyes met, his expression shifted to one of profound relief. Yet I knew, even in that moment, that the story I had to tell would be met with more than just concern. It would challenge everything he and I had ever believed. The days that followed were a blur. My body was weak, and the doctors insisted on keeping me under observation. But even as I lay in that hospital bed, my mind was elsewhere, trying to make sense of what I had seen and felt. The visions of heaven and hell, the undeniable presence of Jesus, and his words, so filled with truth and love, played over and over in my mind. I couldn't escape them, nor did I want to. They were seared into my soul, altering something fundamental within me. But with that transformation came a heavy burden. I was a Buddhist monk, a teacher, a guide for others on the path to enlightenment. My entire identity was built on the principles of detachment, meditation, and the teachings of the Buddha. How could I reconcile that with what I now knew to be true? How could I, a man who had spent his life pursuing nirvana, accept that salvation was found not in detachment but in relationship with God through Jesus? These questions consumed me, filling me with a sense of internal conflict I had never known before. I wanted to dismiss what I had seen as a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by my near-death state. But the clarity and truth of the experience made that impossible. This wasn't a fleeting vision. It was a revelation, one that demanded a response. As I began to recover physically, I realized I couldn't ignore the calling I had been given. Jesus' words echoed in my heart. You have seen the truth. Now you must share it. But how could I do that without losing everything? My place in the monastery, the respect of my peers, even my sense of self. All of it felt fragile, as if it could shatter under the weight of this new truth. I decided to start in the only way I knew how, by seeking answers. Though I was still confined to the hospital, I asked for a Bible, something I had never read before. At first, the text felt foreign, its words strange and unfamiliar. But as I read, something began to shift. Passages I had dismissed before as irrelevant now resonated with a depth I couldn't explain. The words of Jesus, his teachings, his parables, they weren't just stories, they were alive, speaking directly to my heart. I found myself drawn to the Gospels, where Jesus' life, death, and resurrection were recounted in vivid detail. The parallels between his teachings and the principles I had followed as a monk were striking, yet the differences were even more profound. Where Buddhism taught detachment, Jesus spoke of love for God, for others, and even for enemies. Where I had sought to escape suffering, Jesus embraced it, transforming it into a path of redemption. The more I read, the more I saw the connections between what I had learned in the monastery and what I now understood through Jesus. The discipline, the compassion, the mindfulness, all of it had prepared me for this moment, but it was incomplete without the grace and love that Jesus offered. Despite this growing clarity, I was plagued by fear. What would my fellow monks think if they knew I was reading the Bible? How could I explain my experience without sounding delusional or betraying the traditions I had dedicated my life to? And yet, I couldn't ignore the truth I had seen. It wasn't just for me, it was for others, as Jesus had said. One night, as I lay awake, the weight of my calling pressed heavily on me. I closed my eyes and prayed. Not in the way I had prayed before, but in the way I had seen Jesus pray in the Gospels. God, I said, my voice trembling, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to share this truth without losing everything. But if this is what you want me to do, give me the courage to follow. The next morning, I woke with a sense of peace I hadn't felt since my encounter in the light. It wasn't the absence of fear, but the presence of something greater, a certainty that I was not alone in this journey. I knew then that I couldn't keep my story to myself. The truth I had encountered was too powerful, too life-changing to remain hidden. I would face the questions, the doubts, and the rejection, because the love and grace I had experienced were worth it. As I prepared to leave the hospital and return to the monastery, I made a decision. I would share my story, no matter the cost. It wasn't just my truth. It was a truth that had the power to change lives. And for the first time, I felt ready to take that leap of faith. What lay ahead would not be easy, but it would be worth it. The light, the love, the calling, it was all leading me to something greater than myself. I didn't know where the path would take me, but I knew one thing for certain. I could not go back to who I was before. When I returned to the monastery, the familiar surroundings felt different. The stone walls, the chanting of my fellow monks, and the scent of incense in the meditation hall, all things that once brought me a sense of peace, now felt like echoes of a life I could no longer fully inhabit. I carried with me a truth that had redefined everything, and I knew my journey of transformation had only just begun. At first, I kept my experience to myself, unsure of how to approach the people I had spent my life guiding. The weight of what I had seen and the truth Jesus revealed to me was overwhelming. How could I tell them that the path we had followed was incomplete? How could I reconcile my Buddhist teachings with the undeniable reality of Jesus as the Savior? But as days turned into weeks, the words Jesus spoke to me, "You must share what you have seen," grew louder in my heart. I began to realize that my silence was not an option. I had been given this experience not to hide it, but to share it. My calling was clear, and no amount of fear or doubt could keep me from fulfilling it. The first time I shared my story was during a gathering in the meditation hall. My voice trembled as I began, but I spoke from the heart, recounting the vivid details of my near-death experience. I told them about the light, the presence of Jesus, the visions of heaven and hell, and the message of grace and salvation. I spoke of how love, not detachment, was the true path to peace, and how Jesus' sacrifice bridged the gap between humanity and God. The room was silent as I spoke, and when I finished, the reactions were mixed. Some monks looked at me with disbelief, others with curiosity, and a few with anger. One of my closest friends, a fellow monk who had walked this path with me for years, approached me afterward. "Saman," he said quietly, "you're risking everything by saying these things. Are you sure this is the truth?" I looked him in the eyes, the conviction of my experience giving me strength. "I have never been more certain of anything," I replied. "This truth is not mine alone, it is for all of us." As word of my experience spread, I faced skepticism and resistance. Some accused me of abandoning the teachings of the Buddha, while others dismissed my experience as a hallucination. But amidst the doubt, there were also those who listened with open hearts. A young novice approached me one evening, his eyes filled with tears. "I've always felt something was missing," he said. "Your story has given me hope." Encounters like these reminded me why I had been called to share my story. It wasn't about convincing everyone. It was about planting seeds of truth and letting God work in their hearts. The courage to continue came not from me, but from the love and grace I had experienced in the light. As I embraced Jesus as the Savior, I found a surprising harmony between my Buddhist background and my newfound Christian faith. The discipline, compassion, and mindfulness I had practiced as a monk were not lost. They were deepened and transformed by the love and relationship I now had with God. I began to see how the teachings of the Buddha had prepared me for this moment, guiding me to a deeper understanding of grace and redemption. Reconnecting with my family was another challenge. They had always been proud of my devotion to the monastery, and my decision to embrace Jesus initially caused confusion and concern. But as I shared my experience with them, their skepticism softened. My younger brother, who had distanced himself from spiritual matters for years, listened intently as I spoke of heaven, hell, and the love I encountered in the light. "I've never believed in God," he admitted, "but what you're saying, it makes me wonder if I've been wrong." Moments like these were deeply emotional, reminding me that the truth of Jesus was not just for me, it was for everyone willing to seek it. Each conversation, each shared testimony became an opportunity to reflect the love and grace I had received. As I began sharing my story more publicly, I faced challenges I had not anticipated. Invitations came from churches, interfaith groups, and even skeptics who wanted to hear about my experience. Standing before crowds of strangers, sharing something so personal was daunting. Yet each time, I felt the presence of Jesus, steadying me, reminding me that this was his mission, not mine. One evening, after speaking at a small gathering, a man approached me. He introduced himself as a Christian who had left the church years ago, disillusioned by the hypocrisy he had witnessed. "Hearing your story," he said, "has reminded me of the love I once felt for Jesus. Thank you for bringing me back." These moments of impact, small as they seemed, reaffirmed my purpose. My story was not about me. It was about the truth that had been revealed to me and the lives it could touch. Today, I walk a path that bridges two worlds, honoring the discipline and compassion of my Buddhist upbringing while fully embracing the salvation and love found in Jesus. It's not always easy, but it's a journey filled with peace and purpose. I know that the light I experienced was not meant to end with me. It was meant to shine through me, reaching others who are searching for truth. If you've listened to my story, I hope it has touched your heart in some way. Whether you are a believer, a skeptic, or simply seeking answers, know that the truth is always worth pursuing. If my experience has resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts or even your name in the comments below so we can pray for you. And if you want to hear more incredible stories of transformation and faith, check out the videos on the screen. Each one carries a message of hope, love, and the power of seeking the truth. Thank you for watching, and may your own journey lead you to the light.